Here are 7 celebrity confessions told on Joe Rogan, secrets they admitted publicly for the first time and probably wish they hadn't. In episode number 1987 of the Joe Rogan Experience,
Jelly Roll unfolded the kind of story that reshapes how a person sees the world, one built on regret, redemption, and a childhood spent behind the walls of incarceration. What emerged wasn't just the tale of a crime, it was the story of a boy lost in a broken system, a young life sentence before it had even begun, and a man who rebuilt himself from the darkest corners of his past.
Jelly Roll began with honesty, quiet, steady, and unfiltered. He said he'd spent most of his life between the ages of 14 and 25 in jail, a decade lost before adulthood ever had a chance to begin. He said it plainly, not with pride or defiance, but with the weary understanding of a man who has carried his past like a weight strapped to his shoulders. The story that shaped him most, the one he had never fully spoken about, happened when he was 15. He described the moment carefully, aware of its gravity. At 15, he was charged as an adult in Tennessee for a violent felony. The crime, he admitted, was heinous. A group of teenagers, including him, had robbed a couple of men for weed. There was money involved, items taken, and yes, a gun, a real one, pointed at real people. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to soften the edges. He didn't try to justify it. He said he regretted it every day of his life, but he also painted the picture that is often left out of stories like his. He was a kid, barely growing, barely thinking, barely understanding the consequences of the world he was stepping into. He said, "I did not have pubic hair." He was a child acting out decisions that would follow him long after he learned how to be a man. And Tennessee had a law, brutal, unforgiving one. A zero-tolerance policy for violent offenders. No expungement. No forgiveness. No second chances. A boy's mistake translated into an adult's lifelong sentence. That unexpugnable felony followed him everywhere that blocked him from jobs, houses, insurance, and stability. It tracked him across his 20s, his 30s, and into a life he had fought desperately to rebuild. Even after he became successful touring, selling out arenas, earning respect, his past hung like a shadow behind him. He described buying his dream home, a gated golf course community, the kind of neighborhood that symbolized success, stability, and arrival. He put in an offer. It was accepted. He cried. He imagined his family there. He felt, for a moment, that life had finally turned, and then the HOA said no, not because of who he was now, but because of who he had been at 15. The community didn't allow felons. It didn't matter how much he had changed. It didn't matter what he had done for others. It didn't matter that he was now 40, raising a family, giving back to the city he once troubled. His entire adult life continued to be defined by a decision made before he even finished puberty. Joe agreed. He said it was insane, this idea that a single mark could brand a human being for life. That society refused to see the complexity behind why children make destructive decisions. That we forget how environment, poverty, trauma, and circumstance shape young minds before they know how to choose differently. He said, "You could have done the same thing," reminding listeners that any teenager in the wrong neighborhood, with the wrong influences in the wrong moment, could have slipped into the same mistake. This wasn't about a monster. This was about a child who took the wrong path for one night and spent decades paying the price. And that belief that young men like him were not beyond saving is what fueled Jelly Roll's mission. He poured his soul into giving back to the juvenile center that once held him. He donated $250,000 from his last hometown show, sold out an arena, walked through the same hallways he had once paced as a lost kid, and instead of hiding the memories, he confronted them head-on. He sat with the teens serving time. He spent Thanksgiving with them. He fed them. He told them they mattered. He told them they could change. He reminded them that he once sat exactly where they sat alone, angry, forgotten, and that his life did not end there. He told Joe about the revolving door of the judicial system, how he spent his 5th, 10th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th birthdays incarcerated. How he missed all of high school. How he spent 6 scattered weeks in a classroom his entire life. How holidays passed silently. How guards never said happy birthday. How his future felt so predetermined that he didn't even know what hope looked like. But the moment that changed, the moment that cracked open something deep inside, arrived in a way he didn't expect. He was back in jail again, caught in the same cycle that had consumed most of his teenage years. He had gotten a woman pregnant. They weren't speaking. She was furious with him, and she had every right to be. He wasn't present. He wasn't stable. He wasn't the man she needed. One day, a guard knocked on his cell door. May 22nd, 2008, Ford, the guard said. Count time. Jelly Roll responded, expecting the usual routine. Instead, the guard said 5 words that changed everything. You had a kid today. Then he walked away. No warmth. No ceremony. No explanation, just the blunt truth. A daughter had entered the world, and she was as Jelly Roll broke down describing it. The weight of that moment crushed into him like revelation. He felt something shift inside him, a jolt, a spark, a shockwave. He called it a Damascus Road moment, referring to the biblical story where Saul is struck blind and transformed into Paul in a flash. Everything became clear. He could not keep living the way he had been. He could not keep losing years. He could not be a ghost in his daughter's life. He had to. Changed immediately. He said he walked to a bulletin board where a sheet of paper hung a sign up for the education unit. Prison culture mocked it. Signing up looked like weakness, like checking out, like asking for protection. No one from his unit ever signed it. He had walked past it every day for months. But that day, he signed his name. He willingly moved out of the violent offender gang unit. He stepped into a classroom for the first time since childhood. He studied. He worked. He earned his GED. He didn't know the next steps, but he knew he had to take them. He knew he would never sell drugs again. He knew he would never return to the same life. He knew he had something to live for. A daughter, a reason, a beginning, and that was the turning point. Not fame, not opportunity, not music. A guard casually delivering life-changing news through a jail cell door. Jelly Roll said he looks back on those traumatic years so often that he sometimes forgets how deep the pain really runs. He forgets the nights he cried himself to sleep, the silent birthdays, the lost memories, the childhood that evaporated behind steel bars, but he never forgets what saved him. That child, that moment, that sudden realization that he wanted to be better, his life today, philanthropy, music, success, sobriety, stability grew from that moment like a seed breaking through concrete. Everything he does for at-risk youth traces back to that single knock on the door. He said he will pour millions into building new juvenile centers in Nashville, places focused not on punishment, but on healing. He wants trade programs, aftercare support, real education, and counselors who care. He wants kids to believe they can become more than their records, more than their mistakes, more than he once believed he was. He wants to give them what he never had. A chance, a second beginning, a path out, because he knows better than anyone how one wrong choice can lock a child into a lifelong identity they can't escape. He knows how society can brand a boy as a criminal before he becomes a man. And he knows how long the shadow of that brand can stretch, but he also knows this. Redemption is real, transformation is possible, and even someone who spent a decade incarcerated before adulthood can build a life worthy of pride.
In episode Hashona 987 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Jelly Roll's story became a reminder of how a single moment can alter the course of a life. Through pain, regret, and transformation, he revealed how a boy lost to the system became a man determined to break its cycle. His past may be permanent in the eyes of the law, but in the quiet truth of his journey, one lesson stands clear. What we carry doesn't have to define who we become.
In episode number 2232 of the Joe Rogan Experience,
The studio felt heavier than usual, the kind of quiet that falls when the truth is about to surface. The lights were low, the air still, and across the table sat Josh Brolin, peeling back the layers of fame, money, and the slow erosion of identity that creeps in when success becomes a mask. This wasn't a conversation about celebrity, it was a confrontation with the cost of staying human in a world built to pull you away from yourself. And in that space, Brolin began to speak.
Fame is a strange compass. It does not always point north. Sometimes it points inward toward hunger, fear, or the hollow echo of a life built too quickly on foundations that can crack without warning. Josh Brolin understood this terrain, not because he studied it, but because he lived inside its shifting walls. He spoke of money first, the subtle intruder that visits unannounced. When you grow up without it, he said, wealth doesn't feel like comfort. It feels like a temporary miracle. One day you're scraping by, measuring your hopes against your bills, and the next, the numbers shift and the air around you changes. Suddenly, the world becomes easier. Restaurants without guilt. Bills paid without thought. Opportunities that feel like they finally see you, but ease carries an invisible shadow when you've never had money and finally get it. Fear arrives at your door before celebration does. Fear that it will vanish. Fear that you will slip, misstep, or breathe wrong, and the delicate world you built will collapse back into dust. Fear that the bills you escaped will one day find your name again. The human mind was never meant to relax into sudden abundance, so instead it tightens, it grips. It obsesses, and that's when choices change. Brolin described the moment artists begin trading passion for safety, authenticity for predictability. When money becomes the compass, the art twists. Musicians once raw and fearless begin writing radio-safe melodies as if apologizing for the fire they once carried. Bands known for grit drift into love ballad soundtracks and plastic hooks that feel like compromises written in neon ink. Joe mentioned Aerosmith, how the band that once wrote Dream On eventually drowned in polished romance songs designed to sell, not to speak. The difference between hunger and comfort, between risk and repetition, not decline, distortion. A detour from the kind of honesty that once defined them. Money bends artists, but survival bends them more. And then there is addiction, the ghost in the green room, the whisper behind the applause. The parallel is ancient. When artists drift from themselves, something else often steps in to fill the absence. Josh wondered aloud. How many artists return to drugs not because they fall, but because they abandon the part of themselves that once felt meaningful? How many slip because the work no longer feels like theirs? How many numb the silence after trading authenticity for income? Joe countered with a different angle that addiction sometimes creeps back after injury or surgery. When painkillers slip through the cracks of discipline and widen them, he knew too many stories of people who spiraled because the world told them to heal and the medicine told them to stay. And in that crossroads of art, money, and identity, Brolin spoke the name of a man who embodied brilliance and tragedy, Philip Seymour Hoffman. To Brolin, the story didn't begin with Hoffman the legend. It began with Hoffman the son, a young man whose mother approached Josh in a small Rochester theater decades earlier. She looked at Brolin, barely 20, raw with ambition, and said, "I think you're a fine actor." Then she spoke almost offhandedly, "My son just moved to New York. He wants to be an actor too. His name is Phil." A moment so small it should have vanished into memory. Except the son would become one of the greatest actors to ever walk a stage. 22 years of sobriety. 22 years of fighting against the undertow, pulling at his craft and his soul. In the beginning, he resisted addiction not because he feared the substance, but because he feared losing his work, losing the one thing he planned to give his entire life to. Acting wasn't a career for him. It was devotion. But devotion has a price, and the world does not always pay it back. Years later, Brolin found himself on a street in New York, unraveling in real time. He wasn't the actor or the father or the man people recognized. He was barefoot, shirtless, exhausted from a fight with his wife, wandering Columbus Avenue in corduroys and confusion. He looked like a man fleeing something inside that had already caught up. Then he saw Nick Nolte, a legend whose own history was a mirror cracked by time. They locked eyes. Two men who had walked through fire at different speeds, recognizing the same burn in each other. It was a moment without words. but full of truth, a warning, a prophecy, a reflection of what was and what might come. Then Brolin's gaze shifted again. Philip Seymour Hoffman, standing with a friend, listening, polite but unsettled. Josh approached him, half laughing, half lost. "Phil, it's Josh. Man, you're doing so well." And Hoffman, feet angled in two directions, one toward responsibility, the other toward escape, smiled with the kind of discomfort only a sober man feels when meeting someone unraveling. Brolin realized years later that the posture said everything. One foot in the world he worked to stay in, the other pointed toward the world that would eventually take him. He wasn't injured. He wasn't lost. He was tired of fighting himself, tired of expectations, tired of trying to maintain a version of purity in a world that rewards compromise. Tired enough that heroin, after 22 years away, whispered a familiar song. Brolin saw the same pattern everywhere. Actors drifting away from integrity drift toward numbness. When work becomes mechanical, when roles become hollow, when meaning evaporates under contracts and blockbusters, the body searches for something to feel again. That's the part no headline captures, not the overdose, but the emptiness that came before it. Joe recognized it too. He spoke about artists who lose themselves inside work that doesn't feel like theirs, projects that pay well but leave the soul starving. He recalled doing a sitcom, a bad one, and realizing with horror, what if this is my life? What if this goes on for years? The audience sees success. The artist feels confinement. People think misery requires struggle. They don't understand that misery can also grow inside abundance, inside wealth, applause, comfort. A golden cage is still a cage. Joe described the terror of imagining 10 years trapped inside. A project you don't believe in, the suffocating weight of being paid handsomely to pretend you're happy, the grimness of building a life around something that does not reflect you. And when artists feel trapped, they often reward themselves with indulgence, cars, houses, luxuries that create the illusion of joy while deepening the emptiness beneath. A house in Malibu on a hill with an ocean view that you barely use. A car that gleams under the sun but does nothing to quiet the ache inside. A lifestyle financed by a contract that feels like betrayal. Suddenly the bills are enormous, not because you need more, but because you are trying to mask the fact that your work feels meaningless. You build a world that looks beautiful from the outside, so no one sees the storm inside, and then you numb the storm. Then comes the second part of the spiral: debt dressed as luxury, identity dressed as success. The facade grows taller, the person grows smaller, and the artist who once chased truth begins chasing comfort instead. That's when addiction steps back into the room. Joe and Josh agreed. The world does not understand this kind of suffering. People hear about actors earning $50,000 a week and laugh at the idea of misery. But misery isn't about money. It's about misalignment. It's about living a life that betrays the part of you that once stood in a small room with nothing but hunger and hope. Artists don't break because of pressure. They break because they lose the line that connected them to themselves. Money twists it. Fame blinds it. The industry buries it. And addiction numbs the pain of its absence. That is the quiet tragedy behind so many lives. Not the overdose, not the collapse, but the years spent drifting from meaning. Brolin spoke about accountability, responsibility, the continual choosing of truth over escape. It's a choice he never romanticized, one built not on perfection, but on self-awareness. The difference between the artist who survives and the one who disappears is not talent, luck, or success. It is the willingness to stay honest about who you are, even when the world begs you to be someone else. He called it the anti-celebrity, the practice of staying grounded, of giving a damn about people, of refusing to let your ego reshape your soul. Accountability is not obligation. It is survival, and yet the temptations remain. You can justify a bad project because your kids need college money, and that's real. You can justify a shallow film because you're older now, and that's reasonable. But when you start justifying everything, when money becomes the only caretaker of your choices, the part of you that needed, expression begins to suffocate, identity becomes an echo chamber. Ego takes the wheel. And soon, you're not living your life. You're hiding from it. Brolin knew the cost. He saw it in Nolt's eyes that day. He saw it in Philip Seymour Hoffman's posture. He saw it in his own mistakes, wandering shirtless down Columbus Avenue after a fight, lost in the very city where he once dreamed of becoming someone else, the path to sobriety. He said, is not just avoiding substances, it is about refusing to lie to yourself. It is the relentless, brutal work of staying present in a life that constantly offers escape. Joe nodded because he knew. Every artist knows. There is nothing more dangerous than success. Stripped of meaning, you can become rich and still be poor. You can become famous and still be unknown, even to yourself. And when the part of you that once loved the craft disappears, something else always rushes in to fill the vacuum. Addiction, ego, excess, depression, bitterness, or worst of all, apathy. That is the real cost of money and fame. Not corruption, disconnection, and in that disconnection, lives break. George Carlin once said that success doesn't change people, it reveals them. But for artists, success doesn't reveal, it erodes. It erodes the edges of authenticity until the person inside can't find their way back to the surface. Brolin's words carried the weight of someone who has lived enough lives to understand that escape is easy, but return is rare. Authenticity is not natural. It is chosen, built, and defended as they spoke. The studio felt like confession, a dim room where truth rose like dust in a slow sunbeam. There was no glamour in the story, no romantic tragedy, no sensationalism. Just the naked reality of artists navigating a world that devours the very souls it celebrates. And in that room, for a moment, two men acknowledged the same quiet truth, that staying real is harder than becoming famous. And staying whole is harder than being rich, because money can buy anything, except meaning, and fame can open every door except the one that leads back to yourself.
Success can dazzle, and fame can blind, but neither can save the artist who forgets what brought him to the light in the first place. In the quiet between their words, a simple truth remained. Meaning is the only wealth that lasts. And in a world built on illusion, the hardest task of all is staying real long enough to recognize yourself when the lights go out. In episode #1 for 1 of the Joe Rogan Experience, the room felt like confession more than conversation. The lights were soft, the air still, and across the table sat Theo Von, a man whose comedy often hides the darker shapes he's wrestled with. As the studio settled into silence, he began peeling back the wild nights, the coke-fueled spirals, and the moment he finally realized he was losing control of his own story. What followed wasn't humor, it was a reckoning.
Before sobriety, before clarity, before any sense of direction returned to his life, Theo Von lived inside a strange and chaotic routine, a ritual of vests, late-night fantasies, and cocaine-fueled loneliness that felt both hilarious and tragic in equal measure. It wasn't glamour and it wasn't rebellion. It was a man trying to outrun himself in the smallest apartment he had ever lived in. He began with the vests, a detail so absurd it almost softened the edges of the truth beneath it. He'd buy them compulsively, sometimes spending hundreds of dollars he didn't have, convinced they gave shape to a version of himself he desperately wanted to feel. He would slip them on one over another, sunglasses in place, and drift around his apartment like a man playing dress-up for Ghost wasn't. Buffalo Bill madness or self-destruction with intent. It was isolation disguised as entertainment, the kind of personal theater that only exists when the world outside becomes unbearable. He wasn't partying with friends. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply alone, fueled by lines of cocaine and trying to create a version of himself he didn't feel inside. One night, 2 vests deep and wired with the hollow confidence of a high, Theo convinced himself he needed a smoothie. The craving felt urgent, almost primal, the kind of thought only a coked-up brain can rationalize as life or death. He fired up the blender, its grinding roar filling the apartment, drowning out any sense of clarity. And then, in the middle of that mechanical thunder, he heard something, or thought he heard something, outside his door. He stepped into the hallway and the door locked behind him. Just like that, Theo Von stood barefoot, high as a satellite, wearing multiple vests with a blender screaming inside his sealed apartment like an alarm of his own making. Panic arrived fast. His mind raced. Should he break the door? Should he run? Should he pretend none of this was happening? Instead, he walked down the hallway to the landlord's door, the walk of a man trapped not by circumstance, but by his own spiraling choices as he knocked. As the blender continued its relentless roar inside the apartment, as the cocaine sharpened every sense and dulled every ounce of judgment, the inevitable happened. The blender overheated. Smoke rolled under the door. A spark jumped. The fire alarm exploded through the building like a siren announcing the arrival of consequences. Theo stood at the landlord's door trying to explain the unexplainable. The landlord opened with a face already annoyed, already exhausted by the endless unpredictability of human beings living too close to one another. The hallway lights flickered. The smell of smoke thickened. "What's going on?" The landlord demanded Theo, without a single rational thought available, panicked and blurted out the first lie that surfaced. I was throwing a late Christmas party. It was January, not early January. Deep January, a silence hung between them, broken only by the piercing alarm and the blender's dying struggle. Theo could see the confusion on the landlord's face, the effort to make sense of a barefoot tenant in layered vests, explaining why a blender was burning alive. Inside a one-bedroom apartment, when they opened the door, smoke drifted out like a visual metaphor for his life at the time, chaotic, directionless, overheated, and on the edge of disaster. The landlord didn't yell. He didn't scold. He simply stared, disappointed, the kind of disappointment that stings more than anger ever could. But the fire went out. The alarm stopped. And surprisingly, the world didn't collapse. Theo kept living there. Life continued, but the spiral didn't stop. His nights were filled with more cocaine, more wandering, more misadventures that seemed funny until the morning light revealed the truth beneath them. The breaking point came during another night, one that started as an ordinary attempt to numb himself and ended as an unmistakable mirror he could no longer avoid. He had been in New York, doing coke all night, trying to outrun the loneliness that crawled behind him like a shadow. A cab driver named Luigi, the kind of man who appears in these stories like a cinematic cliché but was very real, ended up joining him. They bought coke together, roamed the streets, fell into reckless patterns, and somehow, in the bizarre way only drug-fueled nights can manage, ended up in Harlem with an escort Theo didn't even want. At some point, the boundaries dissolved entirely. The cab driver and the escort climbed into the back seat together, and Theo found himself behind the wheel of a taxi he didn't own. Drifting through New York at dawn, cocaine ripping through his bloodstream, the sky turning pale and judgmental. He had an obligation, a radio appearance. At 6:30 a.m. with Jim Norton and Darryl Strawberry, the kind of opportunity he should have celebrated. Instead, he arrived unable to speak, unable to think, unable to be anything other than a shell leaking adrenaline and regret. Darryl Strawberry sat across from him, a man who had once battled addiction, once lost everything, once felt his career slip from his hands like sand. But now he was sober. 13 years sober. Calm, articulate, composed. Everything Theo W. Oz in single quotes. Theo had once assumed he was cooler than men like Strawberry, that their addictions marked them, that his indulgence made him free and theirs made them weak. But now he saw the truth. Sobriety was strength, not surrender. And he, high-broken, barely able to form sentences, sat collapsing under the weight of his own denial. It was the moment when the mirror turned. He wasn't rebellious. He wasn't interesting. He wasn't living some outlaw comedic fantasy. He was unraveling. The shame hit him not because he embarrassed himself, but because he embarrassed himself in front of two men he genuinely admired. Men he respected. Men he didn't want to let down. When he left the studio, the world felt different, not harsher, but clearer. The fog of addiction had thinned just enough for him to see what he had become. He realized he wasn't making choices anymore. He was reacting to impulses, drifting from moment to moment with no anchor, no direction, no self-respect. There was no chaos he was controlling, only chaos controlling him, That morning, something inside shifted. Theo enrolled in a 12-step program, quietly. Without drama, without spectacle, without performance. There was no revelation, no movie moment epiphany. Just a man who recognized that his life was bending toward a darkness that would eventually swallow him. Sobriety wasn't easy. It wasn't instant. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. He didn't describe the process like a miracle because it wasn't one. It was work. Repetitive, uncomfortable, relentless work, the daily confrontation with old habits, old thoughts, old cravings that once felt like comfort but were really just poison he'd learned to swallow with a smile.
Addiction isn't a collapse, it's a drift, a slow unraveling disguised as adventure until the truth finally catches up. But for those who choose to face it, recovery becomes the return to a life they thought they'd lost. Theo Von's journey wasn't about madness, it was about finding the courage to stop running and look in the mirror. Because sometimes the moment that breaks you is the moment that saves you. In episode #182 of the Joe Rogan Experience, the studio felt suspended in time, two men digging through memory, shock, and the strange fracture in American culture that arrived the day O.J. Simpson was declared not guilty. The conversation didn't unfold like history, it unfolded like a wound, reopened carefully, revealing confusion, grief, and the unsettling truth of how the world can bend around a single moment. It wasn't just a verdict, it was a shift in reality itself. And as they spoke, the room darkened with the weight of that memory.
Some moments in history are not events, they are fractures. Moments when the world pauses, breathes, and rearranges itself into something unrecognizable. For millions, the O.J. Simpson verdict was exactly that. A cultural rupture, a moment where justice, race, celebrity, and violence collided so violently that the shockwaves still echo decades later. Joe remembered it vividly. He wasn't in a stadium or a courthouse or a crowded street. He was in an apartment in Los Angeles, watching with his girlfriend. The city outside was tense, its air thick with anticipation, its residents bracing for an outcome everyone believed was inevitable. Even before the words were spoken, the atmosphere carried a strange electricity, part fear, part disbelief, part grim certainty. They watched as the verdict was read. "Not guilty," Joe's girlfriend gasped, hands on her face, repeating, "Oh no, oh no," again and again, a mantra of disbelief. A reaction so raw it cut through the numbness that had swallowed the room. Joe himself sat stunned, unable to process what had just happened. The expectation had been so absolute, so widely held that the truth felt impossible. Everyone thought O.J. was going to prison. Everyone thought the evidence was overwhelming. Everyone assumed reality was still predictable, but the world shifted. Across the country, people froze in place as though time itself had been interrupted. Some cheered, some cried. Some felt vindication, others felt betrayal, and millions felt something far more disorienting, confusion. A sense that the rules of the world had changed without warning. Theo had been in high school. He remembered climbing a tree, watching the reaction unfold from above the crowd like a witness to history, detached yet entranced. The verdict didn't just ripple through classrooms and hallways, it swallowed them. Students gasped, whispered, argued. Even teenagers who barely knew the mechanics of the legal system could sense the magnitude. But for Theo, the moment came with another layer. He had known Ron Goldman's sister. Not deeply, not intimately, but enough for the tragedy to become real in a way most people never felt. Enough for the crime to feel less like a headline and more like a wound that touched someone he recognized. And that proximity made the verdict feel twisted, surreal, wrong in a way his teenage mind couldn't fully articulate. The pain of the families, particularly the Goldmans, seemed unthinkable. How does a father navigate that kind of horror? How does a family breathe in the aftermath of a murder that dominates global media? Theo remembered seeing Ron Goldman's father on television. He remembered the heartbreak, the anger, the ache. But beneath it all, he remembered something else. Something uncomfortable. Something human. The sense that fame had seeped into grief. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't accusation. It was a strange observation about the way tragedy can warp a person's relationship with the camera. When trauma becomes public, some people recoil, others step forward. In the hurricane of media attention, victims are often pushed into roles they never asked for, and the world watches them as if their pain were a performance. Joe didn't judge either. He admitted he couldn't imagine what that experience would feel like. To lose a child is agony. To lose a child to a celebrity is something beyond description. To watch that celebrity walk free is a separate universe of pain, because OJ wasn't just anybody. He was beloved, a smiling, charismatic athlete, actor, icon, a man who seemed warm, approachable, almost heroic. He was handsome, comedic, larger than life. He was a figure people trusted, a face that appeared in living rooms and commercials and stadiums. To imagine him as a murderer felt like imagining a crack in the sky, something that shouldn't be possible, and yet the evidence was there. The blood, the glove, the timeline. The brutality, but America wasn't only dealing with evidence. It was dealing with history. The Rodney King beating had torn open the city, and the officer's acquittal had left a scar across Los Angeles so deep it still hasn't fully healed. Racial tension simmered in every corner. People remembered the riots, the ethics of power, the weight of the past. So when OJ, a black man, a famous figure, a man who once transcended race in the public eye, stood trial before a mostly black jury, the case became more than guilt or innocence. It became symbolic. Reckoning the reversal, a protest wrapped in a verdict. The FX series captured that context with chilling precision. Cuba Gooding Jr. played OJ with eerie accuracy, the charm, the desperation, the unraveling. But it was the documentary that truly laid bare the anatomy of the moment, the racial tension, the media frenzy, the historical wounds, the city's complicated identity. It was more than a crime, it was a perfect storm. The trial exposed the fragility of public trust. It revealed how easily narratives bend under pressure. It showed that justice is not only law, but perception, a battlefield where symbols and wounds collide, and beneath it all lived a strange biography of OJ himself. Friends from high school described him as charismatic, ambitious, and ruthless in ways no one recognized at the time. Even then, he manipulated situations effortlessly, throwing his friends under the bus when they were caught skipping class, standing beside authority figures as though he were one of them, shifting blame with a smile that disarmed teachers and parents alike. That wasn't innocence, that wasn't confusion, was instinct, the survival mechanism of someone who never did his ability to escape consequences. The head injuries came later, the concussions, the repeated trauma, the blows absorbed during football games that rewarded violence as endurance. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a condition that fractures impulse control and emotional regulation. A condition football players knew too well. A condition OJ's own doctor admitted would be introduced at trial if it took place today. Would it excuse him? No. Would it explain him? Perhaps. Would it complicate the narrative? Absolutely. His life after the trial only intensified the surrealness. He wrote a book, If I Did It, a hypothetical confession that read like taunting, like ego leaking into print, like a man daring the world to confront the truth he still refused to speak. The fact that he wrote the book at all felt like madness, arrogance, or both. Then came the prank show, Juiced, a bizarre, unsettling piece of television. Filmed after the murders, OJ smiling, joking, flirting with women who looked disturbingly similar to his ex-wife. Comedy layered over tragedy, performance layered over guilt. There was even the rap segment, a surreal moment where O.J. Simpson, accused murderer, stood in a room full of women dancing around him, laughing, cheering, celebrating a man the world still couldn't make sense of. It was grotesque and mesmerizing, like watching a ghost become a parody of itself. Joe and Theo watched the clips in disbelief. The disguises O.J. wore, the sunglasses, the outrageous characters. The way people interacted with him as though nothing had happened. The way he navigated the world like a man, both notorious and strangely untouchable. And then came the strangest truth of all. Women still flocked to him. It wasn't a mystery unique to O.J. It was a phenomenon seen across history. Charles Manson, Richard Ramirez, Scott Peterson, men who had done unthinkable things, receiving letters, photographs, proposals. Theo found it absurd. Joe found it disturbing. But together they arrived at a chilling idea. Perhaps some ancient instinct, some primal mechanism, born from centuries of survival, still lingers in the human psyche. Perhaps in a twisted ancestral echo, the dangerous man is seen by some as the powerful man. The man who kills is the man who conquers. And the man who conquers is the man who survives, not a conscious attraction, not a rational preference, something deeper, something evolutionary, something dark. Of course, it only applies to a sliver of the population, people not thinking clearly, people caught in emotional turbulence, people drawn to danger the way some people are drawn to fire. But it exists. And O.J. benefited from it long after the world expected him to disappear. His life after prison was equally surreal, living comfortably in Las Vegas, playing golf 4 to 5 times a week, strolling through hotels and hockey games, like a retired star rather than a man whose name was synonymous with violence. He carried a breathalyzer everywhere, a consequence of parole conditions that could send him back to prison for a single mistake. But even that detail felt surreal. The image of O.J. Simpson testing himself before a drink, carefully monitoring his blood alcohol level, felt like a bizarre footnote in a life already overflowing with contradictions. Joe wondered aloud if he should interview him, half serious, half fascinated, half disturbed. The idea lingered in the air like smoke. What would that conversation even look like? Would it legitimize him? Challenge him? Reveal something? Or simply repeat a cycle the world could never escape? Because O.J. Simpson is not just a person, he is a myth, a warning, a fracture, a chapter in American history where everything we thought we understood, justice, fame, morality, identity, bent under the weight of contradiction. He is the smile that hid violence, the star who became a suspect, the icon who became a symbol, the man whose life reminds us that sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and sometimes fiction tries to pretend it is the truth. Joe and Theo ended the conversation, circling back to the strangeness of it all. The improbability, the shock, the sadness, the absurdity, the lingering disbelief that decades later, O.J. Simpson could still walk into a casino unnoticed, still charm strangers, still occupy a space in public. Consciousness no murderer should ever hold, but that is the legacy of the O.J. Simpson trial, a moment when the world didn't just watch history, it felt the ground shift beneath it.
Some verdicts end trials, but others echo through decades, unsettling the boundaries between justice and spectacle. The O.J. Simpson case didn't close a chapter, it opened a fault line in American culture. And even now, long after the cameras stopped rolling, the shock of that day still reminds us how fragile our sense of truth can be, because sometimes the world doesn't just change, it breaks, and we are left to live in the pieces. In episode Hazona 597 of the Joe Rogan Experience, the studio fell silent as Travis Walton revisited a night that has haunted American folklore for nearly half a century. His voice carried the weight of a man who had lived through something he still struggles to name, something violent, luminous, and impossible to forget. It began as an ordinary evening of logging in the Arizona woods, and ended as one of the most controversial abduction cases in modern history. What happened in that clearing would fracture friendships, ignite investigations, and rewrite the boundaries of the believable.
Memory, when stretched across decades, becomes something fragile, a mosaic of images that refuse to fade, no matter how deeply a man tries to bury them. Travis Walton did not look like someone telling a fantasy. He spoke like a man dragging an old wound back into the light, his hands steady, his tone deliberate, his eyes carrying the weight of something he never asked for. He was 22 then, a logger, hardened by labor, shaped by the blunt simplicity of work in the American wilderness. The job was grueling, the pay modest, the hours long, but the camaraderie among the crew made the days bearable. They cut timber in the thick forests outside Snowflake, Arizona, a place where the trees swallowed sound and the night arrived with a kind of ancient silence. On that evening, the men were heading home after a long day, muscles sore, adrenaline still buzzing. Their conversations filled the truck cab as they bounced along the dirt road, engines humming, tires grinding into the soft earth. It was getting dark, the kind of twilight where the forest seems to hold its breath. Then Travis saw it, a glow, faint, threaded through the pines ahead, moving in a way campfires do not move. At first he dismissed it. It was deer season after all. Hunters camp in unpredictable places. Lantern glow. A flashlight. Someone cooking. Nothing unusual, but this wasn't lantern glow. It was too soft, too steady, too strange. One by one, the other men noticed it too. But there was no panic at first, no prophetic dread. Just curiosity. A shared sense of what is that. As their truck rolled into the clearing, the world changed. The glow expanded into something massive, something hovering. The clearing was washed in an otherworldly radiance that no artist, no film, no imagination had ever captured correctly. It wasn't the harsh glare of headlights or the sterile beam of a spotlight. It was a golden haze, soft yet intense, illuminating the ground with an eerie, dreamlike brilliance. Then the shape came into view, a craft, metallic, disc-shaped, suspended above the forest floor like a silent sentinel. Travis said the moment was mind-blowing, but the phrase couldn't contain the terror or wonder of it. Something primal surged inside him, a mix of awe, adrenaline, and a reckless certainty that whatever this was, it would be gone before he got too close, and so he ran. The others shouted after him, voices rising with panic. "Get back here! Travis, get away from it! Get in the truck!" But the instinct had already taken hold. He stepped into the clearing alone, staring upward as the craft hovered above him, silent except for a low, throbbing rumble he felt more than heard. A sound like distant thunder trapped beneath the earth, a vibration that wormed into the bones, making his ribs resonate. The craft didn't shine like polished metal. It didn't flicker like a flame. It glowed, a steady, golden radiance that made the world feel suspended. Darker patches cut across its surface, areas that drank in the light rather than reflected it. But most of the craft shimmered softly, with a metallic sheen that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. The men in the truck were screaming now. Their voices sounded far away, then the craft moved, a shift, subtle but sudden, accompanied by a spike of volume so sharp it pierced through the clearing. High-frequency tones intertwined with the rising rumble, like machinery winding itself awake. Travis felt the air change, the pressure thickening, the ground humming beneath his feet. Instinct snapped inside him. He dove behind a log for cover, but diving forward had brought him closer to the craft. When he stood, just 8 or 10 feet from the underside of the object, everything happened at once, a flash, a burst of energy, a violent force, slamming into his chest like a lightning strike. The world vanished. The men in the truck screamed. They saw his body lift, thrown backward like a rag doll, and fall motionless to the ground. Panic erupted. They sped away, convinced the craft had killed him, convinced they had witnessed something no one would believe. Travis knew none of this at the time. Because Travis was gone, back in the clearing, the men argued, sobbed, shook, circled back, then fled again, torn between terror and guilt. By the time they returned with authorities, Travis Walton was missing, and suddenly the story wasn't about light. It was about murder. Deputies didn't believe the crew. Why would they? 6 men claiming their coworker had been shot by a UFO sounded like a desperate lie born from violence. Even Travis's own brother suspected foul play. The brush piles in the clearing, cut to reduce forest fire risks, were torn apart. By family members searching for his body, men fought. Accusations flew. Hours passed. Travis Walton had vanished into thin air, but Travis eventually returned. What happened to him in those missing days is a tale he has told, retold, and tried desperately to repress. Even now he speaks cautiously, as though saying it aloud may drag him back into the nightmare. The abduction itself is a separate ordeal, a chapter carved into him like a scar, but the origins of that night remain anchored in the clearing. In that impossible glow, in the moment the world stopped making sense, he recalls more than just the disk that took him. He recalls the other shapes he has seen since spheres of light, black triangles, glowing orbs so bright they swallowed themselves. Experiences he prefers not to emphasize, because one impossible story is hard enough for the world to accept, but those additional sightings and his brother's own encounter with a tic-tac-shaped craft in the same woods hinted at something larger, something persistent, something watching, even now. Travis theorizes that the craft he approached may have been observing the forest for a very specific reason. Lightning years later, he discovered something that startled him. The area where he was struck has one of the highest lightning strike frequencies in the continental United States, second only to the Everglades. Lightning doesn't just burn trees. It creates rare minerals, fusing earth into crystalline structures called fulgurites, long, branching formations created when millions of volts blast through sand or soil. Some cultures consider them sacred, some scientists consider them geological anomalies. Travis wondered if someone else considered them valuable, if the craft was harvesting, studying, or locating these lightning-born crystals. Then his approach wasn't an attack, it was interference, a disruption. A moment when his proximity created an electrical discharge that knocked him unconscious and dragged him into an event far beyond human understanding. For Travis, the memory of that golden glow still doesn't make sense. It was beautiful and horrifying at the same time. A radiance that softened the world while breaking it open. A sight no artist, no film, no reenactment has ever replicated correctly. It wasn't just light, it was something alive, something textured, something that made the forest feel unfamiliar, even hostile. He remembers the metallic body of the craft, smooth, seamless, domed, but glowing in a way metal shouldn't glow, like starlight trapped beneath a surface, like energy bleeding softly into the air. When he describes it, his voice slows, as though he's trying to paint a memory that keeps shifting under his fingertips. After the blast, chaos followed: investigations, interrogations, polygraph tests, accusations that the crew had killed him and fabricated a story. But one detail always troubled him: multiple witnesses, hunters and fishermen at Black Canyon Lake, saw the same glow, the same streaking flight, the same movement the crew described. One witness had military intelligence experience. He stuck to his account. Others refused to go public but never recanted privately. The craft was real, multiple. People saw it. Something was in those woods. Travis Walton, against every instinct, ran toward it, and the life he had before that moment ended. He tries not to revisit the clearing in his mind. He tries to shut out the trauma, the impossibility, the fear that still gnaws at him when he speaks about it. But the memory refuses to rust. It returns with the same golden glow, the same humming air, the same moment when curiosity eclipsed caution. Every story has a birthplace. Travis Walton's did not begin aboard an alien craft, began in a clearing, filled with an impossible light. The rest, the days missing. The table, the beings, is another nightmare entirely. But the moment the world changed was the moment the craft moved. The rumble intensified and the forest swallowed him in a blast of energy that felt like the sky itself leaping through his body. Travis Walton was not abducted from a spaceship. He was taken from the ground, from the forest, from the edge of human understanding. The clearing remains, the trees remain, the lightning remains, and so does the memory, glowing, pulsing, impossible.
Some stories are too strange to dismiss and too haunting to forget. Travis Walton didn't ask for this encounter. He simply stepped toward the unknown and was consumed by it. In the silence of that Arizona forest, the boundary between the natural and the impossible dissolved. And decades later, the golden glow of that night still hangs over the clearing like a question the world refuses to answer. In episode Hashonanin 87 of the Joe Rogan Experience, the studio became a sanctuary for something far deeper than conversation, a moment of raw, unguarded human emotion. Jelly Roll arrived carrying stories, scars, and the weight of a past he never hides. But what unfolded wasn't about him at all. It was about one 8-year-old whose voice shook the room into silence. What began as a simple song became a revelation, the kind that exposes who we are beneath the armor we wear. And as the music played, two men sat across from each other, fighting tears neither expected.
There are moments in life when the world slows down to a single breath, when everything around you dissolves into stillness, and the only thing that remains is the truth you've been carrying for years. In the studio that day, Jelly Roll felt that moment hit him with the force of a life he'd tried hard to outrun. Before the cameras, before the questions, before the long-form rhythm of Rogan's conversations began, he pulled out his phone like a man revealing a wound. "Yo," he said softly. "Let me show you this kid." His voice carried excitement, pride, and something deeper, something trembling beneath the surface. He hit play, the speakers filled with the opening lines of an 18-year-old's voice, a voice cracked with emotion, drenched in sincerity, trembling with grief. It was the sound of someone too young to know life's full brutality, yet somehow old enough to sing like he'd lived through all of it, and from the first note, the room changed. Joe leaned forward. Jelly Roll looked down. And both men went quiet, the rare kind of quiet that rises when music forces you to feel something you didn't plan to. The song wasn't a performance. It was a confession, a lullaby for a father who would never return, a farewell song whispered through shaking breath. Every line cracked like a man trying to hold himself together. Every word felt like the unraveling of something sacred. And every note trembled with honesty so unfiltered it reached straight into the part of the human spirit that still remembers loss. "Look at him," Jelly Roll whispered, eyes glistening. The boy in the video sat behind a microphone, tears barely held back, pouring his soul into a song that sounded like it was written in the middle of heartbreak. There was a quiver in his throat, the kind that comes when emotion tries to drown the words before they escape. The lyrics were simple, but devastating. No need to forget. I know your mistakes, and you know mine. Don't be afraid. It's my time to chase the monsters away. A son singing to a father, eh? A boy trying to protect a man who protected him first, a grief distilled into melody. Jelly Roll swallowed hard. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Holy, crazy, right?" Joe nodded, unable to look away. His eyes locked on the screen, watching the young singer fight tears while pushing out the notes anyway, because some stories demand to be told. Even when the voice breaks, Jelly wiped at his face. "I can't watch it without tearing up," he said, half laughing, half crying. "I've tried. I watch it once and I'm done." Joe didn't laugh. He felt it too, the heaviness, the beauty, the ache. "He's 18?" he asked softly. 18, Jelly Roll repeated, shaking his head. "I'm meeting him this weekend. I'm to the moon about it." His voice broke a little, the excitement and pain tangled into one. "He's so good, so real. Authenticity, that was the theme that kept coming back to them. Not polished, not produced, not curated for views or virality. Just a raw human being sitting with his pain, turning it into a song that could break a room of grown men without warning. You can't fake that," Jelly said quietly. "There's no faking that. It's just raw. Every piece of it hits." Joe agreed, still locked into the moment. "And you can hear it," he said. "You can hear the tears in his voice. You can hear when he almost loses it." Jelly nodded slowly. That's real grief. Losing my father was the hardest thing I ever got through as an adult," he said, voice tightening. "So hearing a kid sing like that, it kills me." The room held the silence of two men remembering their own ghosts. Music, it meets people where they are. It doesn't wait for you to be strong. It doesn't ask you to pretend. It shows up in the places you'd rather hide, the memories you try to bury, the wounds you think time will fix, but never does. And in that room, the song met them exactly where they were, men who had lived through loss, pain, mistakes, and redemption. Joe leaned back. "That's the thing," he said softly. "Music like that, it shows you who a person really is. You hear his soul. You hear everything he's been through." "Yeah," Jelly murmured. However crazy somebody might be, if a person can make something like that, we know there's good in them. Something real. Something beautiful. He paused, looking down at his hands. The weight of his own life hung in the air. The prisons, the addiction, the heartbreak, the rebirth. Jelly Roll wasn't born inside the clean lines of fame or success. He clawed his way out of places most never survive. He knows what pain sounds like. He knows what survival costs. So when he heard that kid sing, he recognized something familiar, the voice of someone who had lived through something heavy and didn't run from it. Someone who didn't hide the trembling, the cracking, the vulnerability. Someone who sang through the pain instead of past it. Joe nodded. And people will look past anything, he said. Anything. If you can make a song that makes them feel something. That was the truth behind all of it. Authenticity forgives. Honesty heals. Art redeems. Music has a strange power. It can expose the darkest corners of a soul and still make people love you more for it. It can turn a stranger into someone you feel you've known your entire life. It can make you forgive someone you've never met simply because the truth in their voice revealed the best parts of their humanity. Jelly Roll knew that power intimately. It saved him. It rebuilt him. It carried him from jail cells to sold-out arenas. And now, seeing that same kind of raw truth emerging from an 18-year-old kid, he felt the gravity of it, the potential, the beauty, the ache. He's got it, Jelly whispered. Whatever it is. He's got it. He spoke like a man witnessing a torch being passed, not officially, not ceremonially, but spiritually. The kid represented something sacred, the next generation of artists who aren't afraid to bleed into the microphone, who aren't afraid to cry, who aren't afraid to tell the truth. Joe played the song again, the room falling into silence once more. The melody washed over them, the boy's trembling voice cutting through every layer of emotional armor. It wasn't just a sad song, it was a reckoning, a son grieving his father, a boy trying to say goodbye, a human being standing alone with the one truth he can't outrun. And in that moment, Jelly Roll, the man who has survived more pain than anyone watching could imagine, cried for someone else's story. Because in that kid's voice he heard his own past calling back to him, this kind of music. Jelly said softly, "It meets you where you are." Joe nodded. And it reveals who someone is. You can't hide from something like that. No, Jelly said. You can't. He looked away for a long moment, his eyes red, his breath shaky, the kind of silence only men who've lost fathers understand. The kind of silence that music can break but never fully heal. I'm gonna work with that kid, Jelly finally said. I've already put it out publicly. Whoever owns his contract, I want in. I want to help him. That kind of soul, you don't see that often. Joe smiled. He's lucky, he said. Jelly shook his head. No, he whispered. We're the lucky ones. We get to hear him. The truth hung between them. Honest, heavy, unfiltered, because the world doesn't often give U.S. voices like that, voices that shatter us, voices that reach into the past and pull every buried emotion to the surface, voices that remind us we are human, fragile, imperfect, and still capable of loving deeply. In that studio, two men who had lived through loss and chaos found themselves humbled by an 18-year-old who had the courage to break in front of the world. And as the last note faded, Joe Rogan, a man who has talked to thousands, was left speechless. Some songs don't just entertain, they reveal, they expose, they resurrect. And for a few minutes in that podcast studio, an 18-year-old with a shaking voice broke open two hardened men and reminded them what grief, love, and authenticity truly sound like.
Some voices don't ask for attention, they demand it by telling the truth no one else will say. In that studio, Jelly Roll and Joe Rogan weren't listening to a kid. They were witnessing a soul unprotected, a song that tore down walls, exposed wounds, and reminded them that pain can still be beautiful when it becomes art. And long after the episode ended, the echo of that voice stayed fragile, trembling, unforgettable. In episode #531 of the Joe Rogan Experience, the studio became a quiet confession booth where Miley Cyrus shed the glitter, the headlines, and the caricature that followed her for decades. She spoke not as the global icon people believed they knew, but as someone who grew up juggling fame, chaos, and survival before she ever understood what adulthood meant. It was a conversation about identity, addiction, childhood, and the brutal lessons hidden behind the spotlight. And as she talked, the truth of what it means to grow up famous came into sharp, unvarnished focus.
Growing up is a slow, stumbling process. But for Miley Cyrus, it wasn't slow. And it wasn't stumbling, it was a sprint through a world built for adults, not children. She was thrown into that world early, shaped by cameras, contracts, and expectations that would have crushed most adults. Fame didn't creep into her life. It swallowed it whole, sitting across from Joe Rogan. Miley didn't speak like someone nostalgic for her childhood. She spoke like someone who survived it. "It trained me," she said, "to have a kind of balance you don't learn any other way except by being tossed into the deep end and hoping you figure out how to swim." And that was the truth. There was no gentle introduction, no slow transition. One moment she was a kid. The next she was a corporation, a schedule, a brand. School vanished. Simplicity vanished with it. Everything became work, rehearsals, shooting, interviews, expectations. Her life split into two parallel tracks, the girl she was and the character she was paid to be. And as the years passed, the gap between them widened until she could no longer tell which one the world loved. She talked about the strange absurdity of being a teenager on the Disney Channel while secretly pushing boundaries behind closed doors. It went from school to how much we could smoke and still play a teenage superstar, she said with a wry smile, a mix of humor and disbelief. Joe laughed, asking the obvious question, "What's the answer to that?" "More than you'd think," she replied. A reminder that childhood, for her, was never innocent. It was frantic, pressured, and lived under the shadow of a machine that demanded perfection while she privately tested the limits of rebellion. But Miley made one thing clear. She doesn't smoke anymore. She's sober. Not because of scandal or trauma, but because of something far quieter, vocal surgery. That moment forced her to learn what no one had ever taught her, the real effects of late nights. Substances, exhaustion, and the toll of living at maximum speed. "It wasn't the drinking," she said. "It was staying up all night. Once you drink, you smoke. And I like to go up, not down. I like to wake up at 110. Fame taught her discipline the hard way, through consequences. Not lessons. Her sobriety, she explained, wasn't about shame or image. It was about clarity. It was about choosing her voice, literally and metaphorically. And although she doesn't rule out a celebratory drink one day, she said something brutally honest. "I get so hungover now. Why would I celebrate by feeling like a volcano erupted in my brain?" This wasn't a celebrity preaching sobriety. It was a woman choosing survival, but fame carries another burden. Identity becomes political without your consent. "When you're someone in my position," she said, "your opinion becomes your identity. You become a preacher." She didn't want that. She didn't ask for it. But when you grow up in the spotlight, the world decides who you are before you even know yourself. Every thought becomes a headline. Every mistake becomes a narrative. She often found herself the face of causes she never volunteered for, her ideas inflated into ideologies. At some point, she made a decision. She would live her own lifestyle without apologizing for it, without tailoring it to what others wanted her to be. Her choices were hers alone, not a message, not a campaign, not a public statement. And yet, beneath the strength, she spoke about fear, not her own. But for her younger siblings now entering the age where experimentation becomes inevitable, she looks at them and thinks of her mother, wondering how anyone could survive watching their teenager navigate a world filled with drugs, temptation, and danger. This led to one of the most striking moments of the conversation, Miley Cyrus speaking bluntly about how society teaches kids, or rather, how it fails to teach them. "If we acknowledge that cocaine exists, that pills exist, that weed exists," she said, "then we should teach people how to do it right. Because kids aren't learning from adults, they're learning from other kids." It was a jarring truth. Society pretends drugs don't exist and then acts shocked when teenagers misuse them. The same applies to sex, danger, relationships. If you're learning about sex from a 14-year-old, she said, that's not good. If you're learning about coke from a 14-year-old, that's not good. Ignoring reality doesn't shield children, it exposes them. This idea stirred something deep in her. She shared a vision she'd been thinking about, creating a children's book series based on realistic stories. Not the sanitized, pastel-colored fantasies where every conflict dissolves into a rainbow. Not the illusion that life is fair or safe or even predictable. I don't like teaching kids that this is sunshine world, she said. Because what are you going to do about it when they realize it's not true? She didn't want to terrify children, but she wanted to prepare them. Because life, as she's lived it, is overwhelming even when you're famous, especially when you're famous, and yet, she still calls her life a blessing. Not because it was easy, but because she survived it. She didn't ruin herself beyond repair. She didn't lose everyone who cared about her. I have a lot of people that love me, she said. I didn't kick out the people who had my best interests at heart. But for a moment, she lingered on that thought. How easily she could have. Fame can isolate. It can distort reality. It can twist confidence into arrogance, independence into stubbornness. She described the danger with painful honesty. That's where you die, kicking out the people who ask, "Hey, are you okay?" The world sees rebellion as glamour, but she knows rebellion can become rot when you push away the wrong people. The real death is the loss of voices that anchor you, the loss of love that keeps you upright. The loss of the individuals who see past the persona and recognize the fragile human beneath. She didn't lose those people. She held on to them. And that, she said, is why she survived, not just physically, but emotionally. Her family became her lifeline. Her parents remained steady through storms that would have destroyed countless celebrity households. My parents are awesome, she said. My dad's loopy as hell, but I love him. Her affection wasn't performative, it was bone deep, shaped by gratitude. She talked about having people in her life she'd known for 15, even 20 years. Rare for anyone. Almost unheard of for someone in her position. A childhood superstar who didn't lose everyone along the way. A global figure who still has the same faces at the table. A woman who went through public scandals, heartbreaks, reinventions, and reinventions of reinventions, yet somehow kept her circle intact. This was the heart of her story. Survival not through perfection, but through connection. She didn't pretend she handled everything perfectly. She didn't glamorize the mistakes. She didn't rewrite her past. She spoke like someone who had fought to understand her own identity, not the one the world assigned her, but the one she carved out slowly. Painfully, intentionally, her sobriety wasn't a moral choice. Her philosophy on drugs wasn't rebellion. Her views on childhood weren't bitterness. Her idea of balance wasn't denial. Everything she said came from the lived tension of being a globally recognized symbol before she was even fully human, Miley. Cyrus didn't grow up in the deep end, she grew up in an ocean. And she learned to swim because she had no other choice. But the most striking part of her story wasn't the chaos, the drugs, the fame, or the survival. It was the calm acceptance she carried now, the peace of someone grateful for her own existence. Aware of its fragility, she said something that lingered long after the words faded. If you're not enjoying this life, honey, you've got it coming in the next one. You better love this one. Most people say that as a joke. She said it like someone who has lived through enough darkness to understand the light, and in that truth was the heart of her entire journey, a life not defined by fame, but by the fight to stay human while living inside it.
Life didn't give Miley Cyrus a gentle path, it threw her into the fire and forced her to find balance in the burn. In the studio that day, she revealed not the icon the world sees, but the survivor behind the spotlight. A woman who learned to hold on to the people who keep her alive, and to love the life she nearly lost to chaos. Because for her, survival wasn't an accident, it was a choice she keeps making, one honest truth at a time.